Wargaming Tactics 101. The question in this vlog, do you need to take first turn? What are the advantages of taking first turn in a war game, building on this idea of being an active player, of momentum? What I mean by that is you've got this plan on the tabletop based on your army, your armada, your list. You're laying over the mission. You know what you have to do. And then you've got your opponent's army. And they're going to be trying to do two things also, trying to stop your army from winning the mission through removing units, tying up units, destroying units, while at the same time accomplishing the own mission dynamics. So being a war game, yes, there's this narrative of destroying enemy units, but at the same time, you're there to accomplish a specific mission. It's almost like there's two things going on in each game. And even scenarios that are head-to-head annihilation, right? Meet on the field and beat each other up. There are still those two aspects. I'm trying to beat you up, remove your units, but I'm trying to minimize the losses on my side. So with this duality, being able to have what I call momentum, meaning take control of the game, put yourself out there to a point where your opponent cannot formulate their own plans. Your opponent can't sit there and say, okay, this is what my lance does. Here's what Fritz is doing. I'm going to move here. I'm going to do that. You want to shift that momentum, capture it where they're in recovery mode, right? They're there thinking, I've got a counter here, and Fritz is moving up here, and he's going for that mission objective. I have to stop him. So this way they're one or two steps behind. Now, I pushed up to my archive here, Wargaming Tactics, on the channel, active versus passive players. And it goes into detail much, much greater in terms of capturing momentum. I put that framework out there. But in this vlog, we're going to ask the question of momentum and first turn. Now, the first thing I ask is this a traditional you go, I go wargaming system? Or is it one that alternates back and forth or has interrupts? A you go, I go system, and you're probably familiar because many war games operate as this. You move all your pieces, you shoot your pieces, you attack, you do your stuff. I kind of sit there, I might make some armor saves, some ward saves, I might make some defensive rolls, I might have some units fall back, but essentially you're doing your stuff. And then it's my turn, and then I get to go. So from that perspective, there is a flaw potentially in you go, I go games. This will be called the Alpha Strike, borrowing a term from Battletech, turn one, annihilation, where this idea that at the beginning of the game, you and I have finite resources. Maybe we've bought our armies based on a point system or some sort of scale like battle value in Battletech. That's fixed at the start of the game, and every time you lose pieces, your battle value, your points go down, go down, go down. You get less and less. There might be some sub-rules where you get reinforcements or you can spawn some sort of units, but essentially that's what you kind of have for the battle for the game. So turn one, if you can't necessarily react, and my army is built in such a way that it has range or it can attack or it has powers, that I can cause so much damage before we even get to the mission. I can cause so much damage that you remove 5, 6, or 7 pieces. If I can annihilate 1/3 of your army, or in some game systems, half of your army before you even do anything, that makes things tremendously easy on my part. Now, put aside for a second, obviously it's fair because it's in the rules, but is that fun? Is that a game that you want to play, your opponent wants to play? I have a lot of feelings on that, but we're looking pure Tactica. So in that case, if it's a system where you go, I go, and you can seize first turn, and there's no reactive way or no way to counter it, and you're forced to deploy on the table, then, hey, turn one, awesome. Now, on a side note, many, many, many years ago, Way of Samhan. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. I would build this army. This was a Space Elf army for Warhammer 40K, and had a lot of jet bikes, had a lot of Vipers, think of like super jet bikes, had a lot of Wave Serpents, think of floating space tanks. The points for the units were extremely, extremely expensive. extremely expensive. So I would play in tournaments and have a 2,000 point army, or actually 1,750 at the time. That shows you how much the game has evolved, ancient history. And I've got like 2 units of jet bikes, 2 units of Vipers, Seer Council, and like 2 grav tanks. That's it. And other people are showing up with armadas of tanks and hundreds of Space Marines and all this 100 Space Marine list, all this crazy stuff. Warhammer 40K being a you go, I go system, and not a very good you go, I go system. When I would deploy my army, a viable tactic, because I didn't have many pieces to begin with because they were so expensive in points, you could alpha strike my army, and then I'm out. So the way I say this as a framework and as an example, even though it's from the dawn of time, when you find yourself as a counter or a foil, when you find yourself in this situation where you weren't able to take turn 1, or someone is looking to deliberately exploit turn 1, are there ways you can counter that by not being there? So at the time, Warhammer had a rule called reserves, where you could start off the table and then come on the table. You'd have to roll and see if you do, but then you would come on the table and you could come on the long edge, kind of like, you're hanging out in the back and zooming in. Well, this worked fantastic for my army because it was so fast with how it moved that I'm not on the table turn 1. Okay. I get to see where you move, and then turn 2, I start coming in and I have my choice of where I want to come, plus I'm fast and I zip around. It was a very, very solid tactic and a deliberate tactic for that army at the time. So can you start off the table? Can you put yourself in a place where you come on at a different point? Barring that, can you use terrain? Can you use cover? But you are very, very limited with that turn 1. So if it's a fixed system, then we want to take turn 1. If you can negate the alpha strike, then you kind of at least know where your opponent is going and what they're going to do, because they're also going to move out of their deployment zone. The downside to that, of course, also is now you've lost a turn of momentum, or I should say they've gained a turn of being one step closer to mission objectives. Now let's look at an alternating system like Battletech, Chain of Command. Well, Battletech and Chain of Command is something a little bit separate because it has interrupts. With Battletech, we set up our toys and we roll for initiative and we trade activating units back and forth. And depending on the units on the table, the number, it could be single pieces or groups. We go back and forth, or if it's a group, I might activate 2 or 3. This prevents the alpha strike in that you get to dynamically react and interact with your opponent. You get to figure out, okay, you move here, I'm going to counter here. You move there, I'm going to counter here. You move up, I move back. But also the shooting phase of Battletech happens at the same time. You declare targets, everything happens at the same time. So from this perspective, the alpha strike doesn't really exist in Battletech. Now, where does that name come from? On a side note, for Battletech players or non-Battletech players, alpha strike is where we have 2 mechs across from each other. You're going to get to shoot, I'm going to get to shoot. But alpha strike is where I fire all of my weapons at you, everything. I don't worry about heat, I don't worry about ammo. I fire everything because I'm going to try and cripple you. Usually this is done on heavier machines or with heavier machines that have the raw firepower. If it's a light mech, a small mech, and it just has one medium laser, I mean, there's no alpha strike. You're firing the medium laser. That's all you have. But if I'm a larger mech with a PPC and lasers and missiles and autocannons, and I'm like, fire everything. The alpha strike is I'm trying to cripple you. But in this case, if I alpha strike you, you can alpha strike me. The shooting happens at the same time. So from this perspective, turn 1 doesn't really exist because we're going back and forth every single turn. It's a very reactive, active system. Now, Chain of Command. So if I'm playing Battletech turn 1, there's no turn 1, really. Chain of Command. Chain of Command is a World War II historical game. I've pushed up to the channel here, Chain of Command tactics and an overview of the rules. Fantastic system. Fantastic. Amazing. That's all I need to say on that. Otherwise, I'll hijack this vlog. With Chain of Command, we roll to see. So we roll to see who goes first turn, and we alternate back and forth. But within that alternation, at the end of my turn, there's a possibility I get to go again based on how I roll a number of d6s called command dice. But at the same time, as I'm making my move, my opponent can, if they've banked enough, if they've rolled enough to kind of save up command dice, they can have interrupts. So it could be my turn and I'm driving a tank down a road. You have 3 command dice and you say, you know what, I'm going to spend one of these, interrupt. I'm going to deploy an anti-tank team and ambush you. Shoot an anti-tank at my tank. Then you could say, I'm going to move an objective, or you can say, I'm going to create Overwatch. Within it, your turn, you can also put units on Overwatch where they fire at stuff that comes into view, even though it's not their turn. So a game like this, while it is a you go, I go, with the massive interrupts, if you manage your resources and your positioning, you can kind of negate that, or at least create some interesting speed bumps. So within this framework, in terms of momentum, capturing turn 1, do you need turn 1? A system like BattleTech, which is alternating back and forth and real time, turn 1 doesn't matter as much. And capturing momentum has to happen in a different way. The turn 1, I go, is not a viable way to capture momentum. In Chain of Command, it can be, depending on the mission, but I also have to remain aware of just what my opponent has and what they've deployed. But something like Warhammer 40,000 or other alternating games, absolutely turn 1. So within that framework of those 3 games, and I was naming those 3 games as a way to share systems that I play that operate and come at these different angles. Look at it as a framework, your own wargaming system. If it's one of those or if it's another one, how do you capture turn 1? Do you need turn 1? As in, if you take turn 1, can it make a significant dent in the momentum and capture the momentum of your opponent, right? Shift them away from active to passive. Or does it really not matter? What are the advantages of not taking turn 1? And if you find yourself in a system where you can't take turn 1, but it could cripple you, the example being the Alpha Strike, how do you minimize that? How do you prevent that? What can you do to minimize that initial first turn shock?